Y ahora la última conferencia de esta mañana, Maximizar el financiamiento para el desarrollo, la gobernanza de las asociaciones público privadas, a cargo de James Bramby, director para América Latina y el Caribe, Asia del Sur y del Este, de la práctica global de gobernabilidad del Banco Mundial. James Bramby, con ustedes. Acá.
Well, nice to see you again so quickly. Actually, just before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the contribution from Mario Passau. I didn't mention him in my earlier comments, but he was an impeccably good colleague who worked with us closely across 19th Street in Washington, D.C. I know he did a lot very directly with this group, but he did a lot more in other places. So I just really valued his colleagueship and his contribution to this area. So I'd like to talk about the role of PPPs and the contribution to PPPs in the context of a wider thing that we call maximizing private finance for development. So in doing so, I'd like to cover 4 topics. The first is that plugging the infrastructure financing investment gap is a global priority. Second, that PPPs are part of maximising private development finance, which is a possible response, but there are many challenges in mobilising this private finance. Thirdly, what is really required to make private finance for development a success? And fourthly, what are some of the efforts in this region to make it happen? So first of all, just some of the gaps that have been identified per sector are just quite simply massive. So if we look at this graph, this is work that was done several years ago by Standard & Poor's and McKinsey. There's an identified gap of about $57 trillion worth of infrastructure spending in the world. Now, that's not an exact science because much depends on assumptions and quite frankly also depends on technology. So technology can have very dramatic impacts on our demand for heavy-end infrastructure finance. And of course, whilst those things can lead to variation in the degree of estimation, things that happen on the ground, such as economic crises, such as political crises, such as conflict, can actually very directly influence the stock and the stock value that is in place. If we convert that 57 trillion into allocations around the world, LAC has an identified gap of about 8 trillion. It's not the biggest, but it's far from trivial. But of course, infrastructure is not the only area, in a sense, where private finance is required to assist the development process. So in the 2015 Development Committee paper that was considered and informed very much the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action, the paper was called From Billions to Trillions, Transforming Development Finance, that what it really identified was that a lot of the language about official development financing is around billions, when in fact what was needed at the country level were trillions of dollars to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In that paper, it was argued that the use of concessional financing should be used strategically to crowd in private finance. So rather than being an end in itself, the idea was that development finance could be used to stimulate additional sources of finance. But it also noted that hitherto the largest supply of development resources remained domestic public spending, but in fact the greatest potential for expansion lied with private finance. And in particular, the multilateral development banks were asked to enhance their financial leverage. Second, to ramp up assistance for domestic resource mobilisation and efficient public spending. And thirdly, to catalyse private investment wherever possible. So the idea of ramping up domestic resource mobilisation is something that I work on a lot. And it's an important one, but it's also influenced a bit by the range and the capacity. So if we have a look at LAC, what is the pre-existing amount of fiscal space to plug the investment gap? What we see is that 31 out of 32 countries have an overall fiscal deficit in 2017, and that the debt, whilst it's uneven across the LAC countries, is at an average of just a little bit less than 60%. So a number of countries, of course, are already involved in fiscal adjustments, but their ability to attack the revenue side, which I just alluded to, is in fact very uneven. So what this graph along the bottom shows the deficit. To the left is a bigger deficit, to the right is a smaller deficit, and it shows the total amount of revenue. The higher up on the vertical axis, the more revenue is being raised. So for instance, the top left-hand quadrant is countries which have high deficits and high taxes. That's actually not a very good place to be. The top right-hand is low deficits but high taxes. The bottom right-hand is low deficits and low taxes. And then the bottom left-hand is high deficits and low taxes. So the countries in LAC are very spread around that. As I mentioned, the top left-hand corner is not a good place to be because it suggests that there's little additional capacity. There's a lot of fiscal pressure on the one hand, but there's not a lot of capacity to raise additional funding on the tax side. It's also a couple of other characteristics about taxes in LAC. Many of you, of course, would know this very well, that high company income tax collections underpin performance in many countries, but international tax avoidance, tax competition and digitalisation pose very significant risks actually to company income tax as a viable and sustainable tax base going forward. Personal income tax collections, conversely, are very low across the board in LAC, particularly in countries with the low deficits. So that suggests that the countries with low deficits, if they did want to raise additional money for spending, they could do so through personal income tax. And then I think aside from the tax structure, LAC countries with low revenues have issues around corruption, which I alluded to earlier, and problems with tax compliance. The net result of that story is if LAC countries are looking to domestic resource mobilisation to raise money to achieve the SDGs, their ability to do so is very uneven. But there are many other challenges, I guess, to maximising private finance for development. So while the infrastructure gaps that I've just alluded to tell us of the underlying demand for additional funds to go into infrastructure, it doesn't sort of address the direct question of what is the supply. So you would imagine if you have a demand, 57 trillion, and a large supply, then this should sort of pretty naturally happen. But when we look at the supply, there was in fact a World Bank report on this that looked at the contribution of institutional investors to private investment in infrastructure. Such spending only makes up 0.7% of total private participation. So in other words, if you have a look at all the institutional investing that's going on, only 0.7% of it is going into public infrastructure. So the banks, which have 40 trillion in assets, the investment companies with 29 trillion, the insurance companies and private pensions, 26 trillions, there is a lot of money out there which is looking for good projects, but the good money is not finding its way necessarily to the good projects. So that tells us really that it's a lot more than just about demand and supply. In fact, what we believe is that the maximising finance for development is really about the need for sectoral transformations in countries. It's also about, in terms of ourselves, the World Bank, to meet this challenge that we were asked to meet. It's also about more effective collaboration within ourselves, between the IFC and MEGA. And it's also about delivering better value for our clients and for countries, of course, to deliver better value for their citizens. So there are the what's called the principles for crowding in private sector finance, articulated in Hamburg, known as the Hamburg Principles, and these principles suggest that maximising finance for development, private sector finance, can expand on the commitments of the multilateral development banks by following these principles, which recognise country ownership, which are about creating an investment-friendly environment, about prioritising commercial finance over public finance, expanding and standardising credit enhancement, and blending concessional resources with private capital. The resource constraints and increased demand, we believe, requires something of what's called a paradigm shift, because development finance, as I mentioned, our resources are contracting at a time when aspirations are certainly increasing. So the MDBs are committed to collectively increase private financing mobilised by between 25 and 35% over the next 3 years to 2020. And these principles that I've alluded to also reaffirm the commitment of G20 countries to foster effective approaches to mobilisation. So from our point of view, how do we try and operationalise that at the country level? This is not all that different from what Raymond was just alluding to. So the first question to ask is there a private sector solution that is sustainable and that limits public debt and contingent liabilities? A lot of Ramon's presentation was about public debt and contingent liabilities, as we'd expect from the IMF. And if yes, then the desire is to promote such private solutions. But if no, that just starts the process of peeling back the layers from the onion. So is it because of policy and regulatory gaps? Is it because of risks, again, which were highlighted in the previous session? Or, in fact, after going through these processes, does it appear that the project still requires public financing? Now, the ability across the world to pick this up and to influence and to implement private finance is very uneven. So the wheel there shows basically that all the blue, I don't know if you can see it clearly from where you're sitting, but all the blue is the East Asia and Pacific region. So that's more than 50% of the world's efforts of private finance for development. And it's dominated by China and Indonesia. Then the other regions of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and LAC make up the rest. LAC is the green bit at the bottom, and Argentina is prominently placed there as one country which is doing reasonably well. Whilst across the world, and from time to time, the amount of the particular countries which occupy the biggest parts of that wheel may change, the actual underlying private finance deals that are flowing in emerging economies, which is the graph on the right, remains actually pretty flat. And part of the reason for that is that in the end, private sector finance for development is not a silver bullet. So there's a limit, in fact, to the activities that are suitable for private finance. If we look at the list of countries below and we look back through time, including learning from errors, but also learning from successes, we see that basically the maximum suitable for private finance tends to be about 15% of the total spend on public investments. So what do we think is required for successful maximisation of finance for development? First of all, it is about having a well-organised and integrated model of public investment. So these are the 8 features that we identified in a paper that I was co-author of about 8 years ago, which really attempts to depict what a well-organised process for public investment looks like. So it begins with having projects which are linked to the country's development strategy. It's also follows that each project needs to be rigorously appraised, and that appraisal needs to be subject to internal review. There needs to be a clear authority to screen and reject projects. So some of those little diagrams that Ramon and myself have just referred to imply that there is that in place, but in fact in some countries that is very disorderly, and the ability of politicians in particular, but not solely, to ride around a well-orchestrated and managed selection process does undermine a bit the quality of public investment. Then following that, there is the issue of implementation, which is about having an effective flow of funds and procurement processes to support the implementation and the operation. And then, as Ramon has alluded to, in many, many projects, be they public sector or private finance, there is a need to adjust as the project is being implemented. The world is an uncertain place. It's impossible to accurately depict what exactly will happen. So you do need a way to adjust to take account of renegotiation, hopefully, which is not biased to one side. And then second to last is the need to maintain asset registers, operate and maintain the asset, which is operation, and then finally to evaluate. We do learn from what we've done, so it's very important to have a process which looks into the rear view mirror. But when we look at where some of these things tend to break down in relation to private sector finance for development in particular, we see that there's quite a focus actually on issues around governance. So one of my colleagues who actually headed the PPP unit at the World Bank would say there's not a financing gap in infrastructure, there's a governance gap in infrastructure, which means that the financing available does not go to the infrastructure projects. So to assist the focus on the sorts of governance dimensions, there have been a series of global roundtables that focus very specifically on the governance dimensions of infrastructure. And associated with that, we've developed 10 governance dimensions, which we think are important. You'll get an opportunity to look at them, but I'd like to highlight just a few. The 3 there in the colour at the bottom is the principle 4, which is that the value for money should guide the decision on how to procure an asset. Principle 7, so that's the value for money between a traditional way of financing from public resources versus private sector financing. I think I should have brought my guitar and joined in. I won't join in the singing though, that would be a bit much. Principle 7, there should be a high degree of transparency across the investment cycle. And principle 10, that mechanisms to protect and promote integrity, some things that I referred to in my opening comments, should be incorporated comprehensively across the investment cycle. So these 10 governance dimensions, we believe, are very important in indicating what may be the reasons that the financing which is available is not finding its way to projects. But if we look from more the global to here in LAC, What should LAC do to get more private sector financing for development? First of all, and it won't surprise you I'm saying this given my comments earlier, there is a need to confront corruption at the national and subnational levels as well as across the region. We at the bank are here to help. The way that this question is posed is corruption is sometimes described as the cancer of corruption, and the question here is, has it metastasized? So that means, has it spread to, in a sense, all parts of the state and the community? So just some of the examples of what we're doing at the country level. So in Brazil, we've assisted with work on strengthening governance in infrastructure to help make project implementation more efficient. And that's really focused a lot on the coherence between fixed-term planning, which is an important part of Brazil's public resource system, budgeting and disbursement. So even though these things all exist, in fact, they were not all that well linked together, which was not helpful for the certainty with which projects were implemented and the ability to attract finance. The second is in Argentina. We have, for instance, conducted a workshop recently on financial accounting and reporting of PPPs, which in particular highlighted the fact that quite a number of the assets in Argentina, which have a public purpose, were not being held on the public sector balance sheet. And then thirdly, for instance, in Colombia, knowledge services around the implementation of IPSAS. So they're sorts of, I think, contributing factors which improve the quality of governance for infrastructure and which is paid off for increased private finance. But it's not just a country by country by country issue or problem. I think what we see in LAC is determination across the region as a whole through collective means to focus on this. So the Summit of the Americas had a theme on corruption and democratic governance. The IMF has recently moved into the field of including in their Article 4 consultations an examination of corruption where they believe it is of macro-critical importance. Thirdly, the 8th OAS Summit of the Americas 2018 theme in democratic governance against corruption, which was held in Lima. Then, of course, there's the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, which is under Argentina's leadership, which puts special emphasis on pushing for integrity in SOEs, managing conflicts of interest, reflecting some of the work that's been done also here in Argentina, and other things such as bribery, public sector integrity and transparency, vulnerable sectors and international organisations. And as I mentioned also earlier, there have been the sorts of events like CRESUR and also Quantas Claris, and most particular with Quantas Claris number 2, which occurred in June in Panama, the identification of the Panama Accord, and in particular there are 3 pillars around quality and transparency of fiscal information, around accountability and enhancing stakeholder collaboration. It's our view, which brings us right back to this group here, that accounting is very central to the ability to maximise finance for development. So professional accountants in both the public and private sectors have a critical role to create an enabling environment to maximise private finance for development. Financial reporting standards based on accrual accounting frameworks help governments and public sector organisations develop policies and programs that deliver sustainable, resilient public services and stronger economies. I think the first balance sheet of the public sector in a complete and consolidated way was compiled by New Zealand about 25 years ago. I think that it has stimulated many of the discussions around issues that were not really hitherto on the table. So the question of what is public net worth, what does it mean? And if it's negative now, was it negative last year or 5 years ago, and will it be negative in 5 years or 10 years? It also prompts questions around exactly what are assets for. And and our view about what asset may be able to be liquefied at one point in time can be quite different from our view about what an asset can be liquidated in another point of time. So I think the profession really has an important role in developing and supporting the globally accepted standards for financial reporting for both the public and private sectors, in auditing and in ethics also, and this assists greatly in facilitating global investments and transactions by ensuring common practices across the globe and supporting capacity building. I think integrating reporting practices are increasingly recognised as well as a catalyst for behavioural change. I mean, that's where some of these questions were prompted from. They were prompted very directly from the accounting profession and around long-term thinking. So certainly when we were in New Zealand, we decided to have a look at, if we knew what the balance sheet looked like in 1999, did we know how it looked in 2039? There is, of course, a heavy reliance on the profession to generate comprehensive and accurate financial reports to enhance greater transparency in government and the private sector operations, which are a foundation for this, the ties between the two. To this end, it's also relevant that the highly professional public sector accountants are capable of developing new skills associated with greater transparency and accountability, and to join in more directly some of the debates around these issues and their influence on their level of private sector finance. So I think we look to many of the people in this room to provide real leadership on this. Thank you very much.